It was the party where everything either came undone or came back together. I've never quite decided which verb is right, because from where I'm standing now it was both, at the same time, in the same cold November air. Sophie found me on the back porch at a little after 10, away from the noise. She had the particular look she gets when she has been rehearsing something and has finally decided the rehearsal is over. Something closed in her face becoming open. The precise expression of a person who has made a decision and intends to honor it before she loses her nerve. She stood in front of me for a moment under the string of lights someone had strung optimistically above the railing, and I waited, and then she leaned close and said it barely above a breath. "I almost told you something last year, before everything went the way it went." I looked at her. "Tell me now," I said. She did. By the time she finished, I understood that I had been living inside a story whose ending I had completely misread, and so had she, and that the only person who had read it correctly was someone who had made it his specific business to keep us from comparing notes. The year that had passed between Sophie and me was the loneliest year of my adult life, and I say that having been through some genuinely difficult years. Not lonely because I had been alone, I hadn't been. There was Adrian, and the apartment we shared, and the plans that had accreted around that shared life the way plans do when you've both decided, without quite examining the decision, to stop treating the future as provisional. But there was a Sophie-shaped absence at the center of all of it that I had taught myself not to look at directly. The way you avoid the spot in a room where the light is broken. You know it's there. You route around it. You tell yourself you'll deal with it eventually, and eventually keep sliding forward. 8 years of friendship. 8 years of the particular ease that develops between two people who have agreed, without negotiation or ceremony, that the world is more interesting with the other one in it. We had the kind of friendship that operates on short sentences and accurate silences, the kind where you don't need to explain the context because you are the context, where the other person already knows the third act before you get to it and is interested anyway. And then, over the course of a single autumn, the texts getting slower. The plans postponed and then not reproposed. The calls going a little longer between them, and a little longer after that, until the space that had been a rhythm became a distance, and I was looking at it from one side trying to understand when a pause had become a gap. I told myself Sophie had pulled away. I told myself she was going through something, or had gotten busy, or that the friendship had simply run the course that some friendships run when the people inside them grow in different directions. I told myself these things with great conviction, and nearly believed them. In the meantime, I directed my attention toward Adrian, who was present and certain, and had, from the beginning, a very compelling argument for the future. Adrian had appeared in my life at exactly the right moment, which I now understand to be one of the more reliable warning signs a person can offer. He was charming in the specific way of people who have learned to identify what you most need and arrive already wearing it. He found me at a dinner party in February, 10 days, as it happened, after Sophie and I had our last real conversation, a detail that did not register as significant at the time. He was attentive and interested in the exact parts of my life I was least certain about, and I mistook this precision for understanding. There is a difference between someone who has identified your uncertainties and someone who genuinely wants to help you resolve them. It can take longer than you would hope to tell them apart. A year later, we were living together and planning, in the vague but accelerating way of people who have agreed on a direction without stopping to check the map, to buy a property. He had equity coming, he explained. A company he'd been early at, before it became what it was becoming. Nothing was liquid yet, but the situation was developing, and the timeline was concrete. In the meantime, if I could front the down payment from my own savings, money I had been building carefully for 6 years, the money that represented the most persistent act of hope I had ever committed, he would cover his share once the event cleared. He was specific. He could describe the cap table. He knew the founders by name, by temperament, by the exact nature of their disagreements in the early days. There was no particular reason to doubt any of it. Sophie had a reason, but Sophie wasn't there. The life I had built with Adrian was, on its surface, an entirely convincing life. He was good at surfaces. Our apartment was well arranged. He had opinions about rooms that he stated with the confidence of someone who had thought about them, and when you live alongside confidence of that quality, you tend to stop providing your own. He was good at the social mechanics of being a person, the right questions at dinner parties, the small remembrances that make people feel seen, the well-timed arrival at the moment someone needs something. I had found all of this reassuring at first. Stability has a feeling, and he was very good at producing that feeling. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that the feeling of stability and the fact of it are not the same thing, and that someone who has studied how stability feels is not the same as someone who is actually stable. He had ways of framing things. That was the core of it. There was always a narrative available, about why things were going a certain way, about what other people meant by what they did, about why my instincts about a situation were understandable but perhaps not the full picture. He was always generous about my instincts. He treated them with a kind of fond indulgence that I mistook, for a long time, for maturity. I thought he was being the bigger person. I think now that he was simply replacing my read of events with his own, while making me feel it was my idea. The property purchase was the place where the architecture of all this became most visible. In retrospect, he had introduced it as a natural next step, and it was. Framed correctly, we were together, we were stable, the market was what it was, and his equity was coming. He said it the way he said everything, specifically, with confidence, with the patient generosity of someone who has thought this through already on your behalf. I had asked the right questions and received the right answers, and the whole thing had assembled itself into a plan before I had fully examined whether the plan was something I had chosen. By the time I noticed I wasn't sure, we were already 2 months into the process, and the down payment was already in a designated account, and the contract was on the calendar, and it seemed too late to stop without a very specific reason. Sophie had the very specific reason. But Sophie wasn't there. The night of the party, my phone buzzed twice within the first 15 minutes after I arrived. "Adrian, where are you?" Then, 4 minutes later, "When will you be home?" He didn't come to the parties of my friends. He found them, he said, a little loud, a little unfocused. The kind of social event where you spend energy without gaining anything from it. He preferred quieter evenings, his circle, his preferred register of gathering. I had been accommodating about this. I was still working out how much accommodation was reasonable, and how much was the particular softening of the self that happens when you are afraid, without quite admitting the fear, of what happens if you stop. I put the phone in my pocket without answering and went to get a drink, and that was when I looked up and Sophie was standing in the doorway. I had not properly seen her in 4 months, and before that only briefly, in the cautious register of 2 people navigating the space where ease used to be. She looked like herself, which sounds simple but isn't. Sophie has a quality of presence that is easy to underread if you're not paying close attention. A stillness that can read as reserve until you understand it's actually the opposite. She is paying very close attention. She has always been paying very close attention. That was the thing I had, for a year, forgotten to remember. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. We looked at each other for a moment with the particular weight of 2 people doing the quiet arithmetic of what they still know about each other and what has accumulated in the gap. "Can we go outside?" she said. "I want to talk to you." And because it was Sophie, and because 8 years of knowing someone doesn't actually go anywhere even when you've spent a year pretending it has, I said yes without consideration and followed her out. On the back porch, in the November cold, under those optimistic lights, we stood with our drinks, and for a long moment didn't say anything. There was, as I said, a great deal to not say. A year's worth. Sophie was the one who finally broke it. "I almost told you something last year," she said. "When things started to go wrong between us, there was a reason for the wrong going, and it wasn't the one you probably settled on." "What did I settle on?" I said. "That I was pulling away," she said. "That I'd done the thing people do when they don't know how to stay present for someone else's happiness." She paused. "I wasn't pulling away. I was standing in one place trying to figure out how to come toward you when I had 2 things to say and had no idea how to say either of them without the other one already in the room. The string lights were absolutely still. The November air had the kind of cold clarity that makes sounds arrive slightly too sharp, like someone has adjusted the contrast on the world. "Tell me now," I said. She looked at me for a moment, that careful, direct, fully present attention that I knew better than almost anything, and then she told me. The first thing was this. She had been in love with me, she said, since approximately the 4th year of our friendship. She had known it for a long time, and she had also known, for most of that time, that I wasn't in love with her, or if I wasn't aware of it in any way I was ready to act on. So she had kept it in the place where you keep things that are true but not yet ready, the interior filing system that holds the facts you're not prepared to act on. She had become, she said, very practiced at keeping things in that place. It was not a skill she recommended developing. I stood in the cold and received this. I let it reach all the way down before I tried to respond. I had been told important true things before that I had deflected before they could land. I was not going to do that here. How did you manage it, I said. 8 years of it. Because what we had was worth more than the thing I needed to say, she said simply. And because I kept thinking the moment would come. And because, when Adrian arrived, there was a second thing. And the second thing made the first thing impossible. And together they made each other impossible. And by the time I worked out that the impossibility itself was the signal, a year had already passed. What's the second thing? I said. She looked at me. I need to show you something, she said. Will you come with me? My phone buzzed in my pocket. I did not reach for it. Yes, I said. Sophie's apartment was a 10-minute walk in the cold. We did it mostly without talking, the way two people walk together when the real conversation is saving itself for indoors. Her apartment looked exactly as it always had. The deliberate intelligence of her bookshelves, the drafting table in the corner of the sitting room, the 2 chairs by the window arranged as if a conversation were already scheduled for them. She made tea. I sat down. She opened her laptop and turned it toward me. And before she showed me anything, she said the thing I needed to understand first. When I found out what I found about Adrian, she said, I had to reckon with the fact that I was in love with you, and those 2 things made each other unsayable. Because if I came to you about him, you'd hear it as jealousy. And if I came to you about how I felt, you'd be too overwhelmed to hear anything else. And if I said both at once, you'd spend weeks trying to work out which one was real and which one was cover. And I couldn't bear to be the person you thought was manufacturing a crisis just to be the person you ran to. She looked at her hands for a moment. So I stayed quiet. I kept the documentation. I waited for a moment that felt clean enough, and then he made sure the clean moments kept not arriving. He made sure, I said. In a minute, she said. First, the cap table. She pulled up a public filing from the company Adrian had described, the one whose equity was meant to cover his share of the property purchase, the one that was why the down payment was mine. The contract was on Thursday morning, 3 days from now. His name was not in the document. I looked at the filing. I looked at the list of equity holders across their several rounds. I scrolled through it twice. His name was not there. It's a public record, Sophie said. I found it in September. I'd heard about the company at a professional event and looked it up on a whim. He's not on the cap table. He was never on it, or he was removed from it before this filing, and I've found nothing to suggest the latter. She opened another tab. But then I kept looking. She had not done this carelessly. She had done it the way she approached anything she needed to understand, methodically, at pace, with the specific patience of someone who would rather be wrong and thorough than right and hasty. What she had assembled over the 3 months since September was a pattern rather than a single fact. She had found a woman named Mara in a different city, who had encountered a version of Adrian 18 months earlier. Different name on that occasion, different sector, same structure. A joint property purchase, a promised equity event approaching the horizon, a down payment fronted by the woman who believed him. Mara had lost a significant sum. She had documented what happened to her with the meticulous precision of someone who did not intend to be the only person who knew about it, and who was prepared to wait as long as it took for the documentation to become useful. Sophie had reached out to Mara in October. Mara had responded within the hour. She's been waiting, Sophie said, for someone else to call who could add another piece. She always suspected there would be one. She looked at me. She's been very thorough. What she has, added to what I have, is not a suspicion. It's a record. I sat with all of this for a long time, the tea cooling in front of me, the bookshelves quiet, the window showing me a dark street where the ordinary November evening was going about its business, entirely indifferent to the architecture of what I had just understood. 6 years of savings. A contract in 3 days. A phantom stake that had never had his name attached to it. There was a quality to sitting with this that I want to be precise about, because it was not what I expected. I had thought, vaguely, that the moment of discovering you've been deceived would feel like the floor dropping out. It didn't. It felt more like a light coming on in a room you'd been navigating in the dark. The furniture was the same, but now you could see it, and the bruises on your shins suddenly had an explanation. The relief and the shock arrived at the same time, and the relief was in some ways larger. Because I had been navigating in the dark for a year, and I had been calling the bruises clumsiness, and there was a specific grief in that, and also a specific freedom in having it finally explained. He's been spending your future on someone else's past, Sophie said. The equity was never going to arrive. The structure is designed to close before you realize it hasn't. You would have been left with debt on a purchase that didn't clear, and he would be gone. The contract is Thursday morning, I said. I know, she said, which is why I found you tonight. There was one more thing. She had kept it for last, because she had known from the moment she worked it out that it would be the hardest to hear. She opened the timeline document. It began in February, the month Adrian had arrived, and it was specific and dated and annotated in the careful way of someone who has spent months building an argument they hope they'll never have to use. March. He mentions to you, twice in 1 week, that Sophie seems a little distant lately. April. The dinner where he has a prior engagement that turns out not to exist. You go alone. You arrive without your person. June. The birthday invitation that was never sent. I stopped at June. I had been quietly wounded by June. I had told myself Sophie had chosen not to come. I had told Adrian I was hurt, and he had been so gentle about it, so warm and reasonable and understanding about the difficulty of friendships that drift when people change, so quietly supportive of me releasing the weight of expecting consistency from people who seemed unable to offer it. He had been very kind about June. He had helped me understand it in a way that made me feel less abandoned and more grown up about the whole thing. There's nothing on my end from that period, Sophie said. No email, no message, no invitation reached me. I looked for it when you went quiet, because I wanted to understand when the last time was that you'd reached toward me, and there's nothing there. I thought about what June had done to me, hurt and slightly resigned, and more reliant on Adrian than I had been in May, and slightly more willing to believe that he understood me in ways Sophie no longer seemed to. I had taken that feeling as accurate information about the situation. It was accurate information. Not about the situation I thought. He knew you were the person who would have stopped him, I said. The sentence arrived fully formed before I had finished thinking it. Yes, Sophie said. The silence after that had weight, not the silence of something terrible, but the silence of something terrible becoming fully visible, which is a different thing, and in some ways less frightening. I'm sorry it took me this long, she said. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is I was scared of getting it wrong, and scared of what getting it right would cost, and by the time I stopped letting those fears make my decisions, a year had passed. She looked at me. I should have found a way sooner. I should have said both things and accepted the mess they made. You're here now, I said. That's what we have to work with. We worked through the night. Sophie called Mara at 11:45. Mara picked up immediately, because she had told Sophie in October to call the moment things moved, and she had meant it. She had stood in this exact spot. She knew what a Thursday looked like from a Monday, and she was not going to let someone else stand there alone if she could help it. The three of us, on a call for over an hour, built the sequence of steps that needed to happen before Thursday morning. Sophie had legal contacts from her professional network. She had already identified who could advise quickly and had primed them. Mara had the original documentation, specific and sourced well enough that a solicitor could work with it. I had the contract itself, which I pulled up while we were talking, and which contained several explicit representations about Adrian's equity position that were, in light of the cap table and Mara's record, demonstrably false. After the call, Sophie and I went through everything again together. She had built a careful index. She had always moved through a problem the way she moved through a room, with no wasted motion and a clear sense of where she was going. The index was color-coded. Financial misrepresentation in one category, documented prior pattern in another, the engineered estrangement in a third. She had a notes column where she had flagged each item's evidentiary value, what it proved on its own, what it needed alongside it, what a solicitor would find most useful versus most supplementary. She had, in other words, not merely kept records. She had prepared a case, and she had prepared it with the attention of someone who understood that the moment it needed to be used, it would need to be used quickly. I watched her work and thought about all the evenings over the past year I had spent across a table from Adrian's version of attention, the kind that performed interest in my life without actually absorbing any of it, the kind that could describe what I did without knowing what it cost me to do it, the kind that praised the category without ever knowing the specific content. He had told other people I was brilliant. He had never once asked what I was most afraid of failing at. I had taken the praise as knowing. I understand now that it was inventory. And then I looked at what Sophie had assembled, alone, at midnight, over 3 months, in service of a person who hadn't known she needed it. The difference was not a subtle one. "Can I ask you something?" I said, around 1 in the morning. She looked up from the laptop. "For the past year while you were building all of this, were you hoping you were wrong about him?" She thought about it with the honesty of someone who doesn't round numbers in their own favor. "For the first 2 months, yes," she said. "After October, no. By October I was certain. I was just working out how to hand it to you in a way that was survivable." A pause. "I needed it to be clear enough that you didn't doubt it, and specific enough that it didn't look like grief. I needed you to be able to look at it straight and know. What made you decide tonight was the moment?" "When I saw you at the door," she said, "and you had that particular look." "What look?" She considered how to describe it. "The look of someone who is performing fine in a way that is becoming very expensive," she said. "I know that look. I've been watching for it." She looked back at the laptop. "I thought, if not tonight, when? So." I thought about the particular care required to carry information for someone else. Not to use it, not to deploy it too early, but to hold it ready in exactly the shape they'll need it, and wait for the moment when offering it is the most useful available act. "You've been looking after me for a year," I said, "without telling me you were doing it." "It was the only thing I could do from where I was standing," she said. I sat with that for a long moment. From where she was standing, loving me, knowing what she knew, kept at arm's length by someone who had calculated that she was the primary threat to his plan. The only available act of care had been to stay ready, to build the case, to show up at the party, to decide that tonight was finally the night. "Sophie," I said. She looked up. "I've been looking at you for 8 years," I said, "and not seeing half of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the small honesty that was always more devastating than the large kind, "I know. I kept hoping you'd get there." "I'm here now," I said. "Yes," she said, "you are." I contacted the estate agent Thursday morning. I said I needed to pause the process pending review of documentation. I sent Adrian a message that referenced the cap table, the company filing, and several specific points from Mara's record. His response arrived, and then another, and then silence. The response pattern of someone who has been caught in the specific way they had been planning around being caught and therefore has no available defensive position. He collected his things from the apartment over the following weekend without ceremony. He did not contest what I had said. He did not explain, he understood what I had, and he left. Mara is working with a solicitor. I have added my documentation to hers. I won't describe the full outcome here because it is still in process, but the people who needed to know now know, and Mara's meticulous record will not have been assembled for nothing. That first week after Adrian left, Sophie came over every evening. She didn't ask to, she simply arrived, at around 6:30, with something she'd picked up on the way, and she sat with me, while I sat with the new shape of things. I had lost a person and a plan and a version of the future I had been building toward, and the loss was complicated in the way losses are when you are also, underneath the complication, relieved. When you understand that what you are grieving is a fabrication, and the relief and the grief run alongside each other without resolving into either one. I had also lost something harder to name, the version of myself who had not noticed. She had been a person who thought the warmth in her life was coming from one direction when it was coming from another entirely. She had been a person who filled a Sophie-shaped absence with something that looked, from the outside, like a life. Working out what to do with that person, how to be generous toward her while also understanding what she had missed. and how long she had missed it, took time I was grateful to have. What I still had, what had been there the entire year, maintaining a quiet, careful record in the background, was sitting across from me in my kitchen, asking whether I wanted the window open, entirely not going anywhere. Sophie had always been very good at simply being present. She did not require me to perform recovery. She did not ask how I was feeling in a way that required a progress report. She brought food and sat down and let the evenings be what they were, and I understood that this was also a form of the same attention she had been paying for 8 years, the kind that doesn't need you to be a particular version of yourself to be worth sitting with. We did not address the first thing she had told me for several days. It sat between us, acknowledged and unhurried. Sophie had been carrying 2 impossible things at once for a year. She was not going to rush the unpacking of either. And I needed time to look honestly at my own interior, to sort through what the year had made of me, what had been there before Adrian arrived, what I had been substituting for what, and what I was finding now that the noise had stopped and I could finally hear what had been underneath it the whole time. About 10 days after the party, Sophie was at my sink doing the washing up, and I was at the kitchen table, and there was between us a quiet of a certain quality, not the empty quiet of 2 people with nothing to say, the full quiet of 2 people who have said the difficult things and have arrived in the space on the other side of them, where the air is different. I watched her for a long moment. "You've been paying attention to me for 8 years, I said. She didn't turn around. "Yes," she said. "You kept a record," I said. "You built the case. You held it ready without using it for any purpose except to hand it to me when I needed it." "Yes," she said again. "And before all of that, and through all of it, you were in love with me." She turned around. She looked at me with the full, direct, patient weight of the expression I had known for 8 years without fully reading, all its layers present, all its steadiness, and all the thing underneath the steadiness that had always been there, that I had been looking at for 8 years without quite allowing myself to see. "I'm still in love with you," she said. That part didn't have a before. The kitchen was very quiet. "I almost lost you twice," I said. "Once because neither of us said anything. Once because someone understood that you were the one person who would stop him, and made sure you couldn't reach me." She nodded. "I'm not doing either again," I said. She came and sat across from me. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been patient for the appropriate amount of time and is finding, now, that it was worth it, and who intends to remain patient because the patience has never once been wasted, not in 8 years of it. "No," she said, "neither am I." The window was still showing me the dark street. The tea from earlier had long gone cold. Outside, the November evening was doing what November evenings do. Indifferent, unhurried, lit in the scattered way of cities that don't know they're providing atmosphere. Inside, 2 chairs by a window, arranged as if a conversation had always been scheduled for them. It turned out one had. There is a particular kind of near miss that you can only understand from the far side of it. The life that almost went differently, the sentence that almost stayed inside, the conversation that almost didn't happen because you almost left the party an hour earlier, or Sophie almost decided tonight was not the night, or the year almost stretched into another year without a November porch, and a decision that the rehearsal was over. I think about that other version sometimes. I think about what Thursday morning would have looked like. The table, the contracts, the pen in my hand, 6 years of accumulated hope, signing itself over to someone who had studied what I most needed and made himself into it. I think about Sophie across the city, alone with 2 truths she hadn't spoken, both of them genuine, both of them tangled together into a silence that a particular kind of person had counted on to last long enough for Thursday to arrive. I think about how close those 2 things, my Thursday and her silence, came to simply happening, simply unfolding as designed, because one person found the right architecture, and another person was afraid of the wrong thing, and neither of us said what we meant quite soon enough. What closed the distance was one conversation on one cold porch, because one person decided the rehearsal was over, and the cost of waiting had finally exceeded the cost of saying. She had been carrying 2 impossible things at once for a year, and the reason they were unsayable separately was the same reason they mattered. They were both about me, and both real, and she cared enough about getting it right to stay present and patient and ready, and to hold the documentation, and to show up at the party, and to stand in front of me in the November cold and offer both things at once and let me decide what to do with them. She could not control whether I was ready to receive what she had to say. She could only show up and say it. I think about that a great deal, now. The courage of showing up when you don't know how you'll be received. The specific generosity of carrying something for a person, alone, for a year, and then putting it on the table without asking to be thanked for it, because the point was never the carrying, the point was always what they needed the thing for. Sophie knew. She has always known things about me that I hadn't worked out yet. The difference is that I know how to look back now. I know how to sit across from someone who has been paying attention and let the attention actually land, instead of receiving it the way you receive a transit system, with relief and without examination, as if it simply appears and requires nothing from you. It is the most disorienting discovery that the person who knew you best was the one you had let yourself stop seeing, and it is the most clarifying to find that the knowing was still there, intact and patient and entirely unchanged, waiting for you to finally turn around. Before you go, I want to ask you two things, and I want you to sit with them honestly for a moment rather than scrolling past. Have you ever been one honest sentence away from a completely different life? The kind of sentence that couldn't quite come out because it had another one tangled up inside it, each one making the other impossible. And is the person who has been carrying that sentence still close enough to hear it, or has something or someone put just enough distance between you that they've started to think the moment may have already passed? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, someone might be on a cold porch right now, deciding whether tonight is finally the night to stop rehearsing.